There's Mills. Hi, Mills.
Hey, Steve. How are you?
I'm just wonderful. How about you today?
I'm doing great.
So look at you with a collared shirt on and everything.
I know.
You came dressed up.
I know. It's crazy. It's warm here, though.
Is it? What is it?
Yeah, it's actually only in the 60s, but it just feels warmer for some reason. At the moment, I'm in Virginia, actually. We have a cabin in the mountains outside of Front Royal in Northern Virginia, and so I'm up there. But it's been hot in North Carolina.
So I don't think North Carolina knows hot, though, you think, compared to Nevada?
No, not compared to Nevada. But of course, we have a little bit more humidity than you do.
Yeah, I do miss the humidity back east. So it was so good on my complexion. Ha ha.
Right, exactly.
Welcome to the Art Box Podcast, where creativity lives, but more importantly, where stories are told. I'm your host, Steve, and here we believe every piece of art carries a story, and every artist has one worth sharing. From theater and song to archaeology and to our public lands, we explore the many ways creativity shows up in the world around us. Because I'm always happy to view a work of art, but I'm never fully satisfied until I've heard the story behind it. That's what we're all about, unpacking the journeys, the moments, the people, and the meaning that bring art to life. So whether you're an artist, a storyteller, or simply curious, pull up a chair. Let's open the box.
Oh, effortlessly beautiful. That's Venus and being you.
Well, Mills, welcome to the Art Box. Thank you very much for coming on.
Sure.
I'm not even sure how we connected, but I'm sure glad we did.
Yeah, I can't even remember now. It's been a while, so.
It's been at least a couple of weeks. I can't remember past that. So, Mills, want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a retired professor of history. I retired last year, taught at George Mason University for 24 years, and before that at Texas Tech for 3. Lately, I have been focusing a lot of my attention on the history of the Appalachian Trail.
Addie breaking in here wishing a big hello to Professor Kelly. I've been quietly listening in, and I have to say, there's something about the way history unfolds through story that feels a lot like walking a trail, step by step, layer by layer. And speaking of trails, today I couldn't resist wandering, at least in spirit, onto the Appalachian Trail. This remarkable footpath stretches over 2,190 miles, beginning at Springer Mountain in Georgia, and winding its way north to Mount Katahdin in Maine. 14 states, countless stories, and more than a few moments where the only sound is your own breathing and the crunch of earth beneath your boots. The trail itself was first imagined by Benton Mackay in the early 1920s, a vision not just of recreation, but of connection between people, land, and time. And I think that's why I've been so drawn to it while listening to you both. Because history, like a long trail, isn't just about the destination. It's about the journey through it. The pauses. The overlooked details. The stories tucked just off the path. One day, I think I'd like to hike at least a piece of the Appalachian Trail myself. Not to conquer it, but to experience it. To notice the way the light moves through the trees, to meet the people along the way, and to understand, just a little better, how landscapes shape the stories we tell. Until then, I'll keep wandering through conversations like this one. All right, Steve, I'll hand it back to you and Professor Kelly, though I may be quietly packing a virtual backpack in the background.
Written a couple of books about it, a bunch of articles, did a podcast with 50 episodes called The Green Tunnel. So that's really taken up a lot of my space over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I've listened to the podcast. It's very good.
Yeah, the best thing about that podcast is that every episode was produced by a student. They really learned a tremendous amount during that production process. The podcast came out of a digital history research center, and so these were our grad students who were working in the center to help with us, who help with projects like that.
Tell us about 6-year-old Mills. What were you doing?
Oh boy, when I was 6, I was actually in private school in the first grade because Virginia was just coming out of segregation, and my parents did not want me to go to the public school in the last year of segregation, and so they sent me to a little private school that was in somebody's house. And that's what I remember about it. Yeah, I was an only child and just growing up kind of a typical suburban existence.
And where was that at?
Falls Church, Virginia, so the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C.
Okay. I grew up in College Park, Maryland, so we weren't too far away from each other.
Right.
So, in good times, but boy, I can remember, way back when, I can remember going with my dad to a party they had at one of the beaches along, I think, Mayo Beach or something like that, along the Chesapeake. And there was a sign, and I asked my dad, what's that mean? It said something about no blacks, no one like other than of the Caucasian race. It said something like that. And it's stuck in my mind to today.
Yeah, it's really... it's almost impossible to find physical evidence of all of that now. I mean, you have to really know where to look. So we lived for many years in the little town of Manassas, and the train station had 2 waiting areas.
Oh.
One of which is now like the Visit Manassas Tourism Office. If you know that that's what you're looking at, then you realize that one of them was the white waiting area and one of them was the black waiting area.
Sad, and I guess we've gone past that quite a bit. I'm not sure enough yet, but you've been hiking the Appalachian Trail since 1971.
That's right.
Okay. Do you remember your very first hike?
I remember. I don't remember the hiking part. I remember how excited I was to be sleeping in my own tent, my very own tent. It was just like, to me, it was super cool to have this tent that I'd carried on the trail, and that then I was just in by myself. I liked it.
Oh, that was cool. Did the tent have a floor?
It did, but you still wouldn't describe it as waterproof, and it did not have mosquito netting. It was mine. That's what was really important.
I can remember those early tents. So how about your shoes? Did you have hiking?
Yeah, we actually had hiking boots. I was in a Boy Scout troop. That's how I got started backpacking. And our Scoutmaster was pretty insistent that we have boots. And my first pair of boots actually came from the Navy surplus store, not too far from us. So they were some kind of Navy boots, not hiking boots, but they were boots.
Yeah, and what I can remember most about those days is that you had to break a shoe in. So or you'd get blisters. Did you break them in before? Or?
I may have, but I sure remember having a fair number of blisters. So maybe I didn't do it the right way. But for me, the most revelatory moment about hiking on the Appalachian Trail came the following year, because my Boy Scout troop was in the city of Falls Church, and there was a guy who lived nearby named Ed Garvey. And he wrote the first book about a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. And he wasn't the first through hiker. He just first person to publish a book about it in 1972 or 71. And he came and spoke to our scout troop. And I remember being absolutely amazed that this trail that we hiked on went all the way to Georgia, where my grandparents lived, and all the way up into Maine, which at that age was kind of a vague concept for me. And then I went back to the trail, because we always hiked on the Appalachian Trail in Shenandoah National Park. That's just kind of where we went. And our Scoutmaster had never mentioned that it was a 2,000-mile long trail. And but I remember the next time I went, going and standing at the trail and looking south and thinking, wow, I could hike all the way to my grandparents' house.
About the Appalachian Trail, it has a history of public recreation. That makes it worthy of deeper historical exploration, I assume. And that's kind of what you're doing with your podcast and with your other work.
Yeah, the trail's a little over 100 years old now. The first section was laid down in 1922, so it's 104 years. And that 100 years has been, quite a century in the United States. But also the Appalachian Trail really helped put forward the concept of public recreation in the mountains as a place for people to go. And because, it was never designed or intended to be a long distance hiking trail. It was just intended to be a really long trail that people would hike on. So, they go out for a few hours, few days, that sort of thing. But it was not intended to be a trail that you would hike 2,000 miles on. And so tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people have been doing that ever since, just going up to the trail and spending some quality time under the trees. And it really helped promote that idea of spending time in the mountains as a kind of a weekend activity.
How has business grown up around it?
You mean like in the towns nearby?
Yeah, in the towns nearby. I know some about, on the Pacific Coast Trail, that I don't think anything's grown up with lights and McDonald's and things like that. You got to go a little ways off the trail to get to civilization.
Yeah, so the Appalachian Trail is a lot more in civilization. It's a wild trail, but it's not that wild. And so you can, it crosses a road something like 3,000 times, and it's 2,000, almost 200 miles now. And a lot of those roads are paved, and you can walk into town or hitchhike into town, and or increasingly get a shuttle driver who will pick you up. And people have side businesses as kind of, shuttling hikers back and forth to the trail. A lot of the little towns along the trail have really benefited from that. Hot Springs, North Carolina, Damascus, Virginia. A lot of these little Duncannon, Pennsylvania. A lot of these little towns would have shriveled up and died years ago, except that hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of hikers pass through, and they stop at the Smoky Mountain Diner in Hot Springs, and they get a delicious cheeseburger, and because they are delicious, and homemade pie, or they. In Damascus, they go to Trail Days, which is a huge hiker event that happens second weekend in May every year, and several thousand people descend on this little town of 500 people. And so it's kind of like a NASCAR race for them. And so it's just a constant, flow of business that helps keep ice cream parlors, diners, outfitters going. And so in addition to that, a whole network of trailside hostels has grown up where, people rent to hikers and make some money that way too.
How true was the Bill Bryson book and subsequent movie?
So we have to make a real clear distinction between the two because the book was, really spot on in most ways. I mean, Bryson, I've read it a couple times, and he made a couple of mistakes, but they were trivial mistakes that don't really matter at all. And, for instance, he said that Myron Avery, who was the longtime chairman of the Appalachian Trail Conference, was publicity shy, which is exactly the opposite of how Myron Avery was. He was a publicity hound. But like, that doesn't matter in terms of the story that Bryson was telling. That's just a trivial detail that probably me and three other people noticed. And so, but in terms of his account of what the hiking experience was like, I think it's really pretty spot on. The movie, not so much. There's a lot in the movie that just made no sense whatsoever. There's one scene where Robert Redford he's staying in a motel, which people do, and Mary Steenburgen is the owner of the motel, and Redford's feeling a little lonely, and she's beautiful, and they start chatting in the parking lot. But, okay, he was wearing pajamas. In the history of long-distance hiking on the Appalachian Trail, nobody has packed pajamas, I'm quite certain. The other thing that drove me crazy about the movie was that they had hiking sticks with them, trekking poles, and those trekking poles never left their backpacks throughout the movie.
Oh. During COVID, and that's kind of when you started the podcast, right?
Yeah, we started the podcast in the kind of the waning days of COVID.
Okay, so with the audio storytelling, how did that allow your students to discover traditional academic writing that a traditional academic writing might not?
That's really a great question. And many of our students, both undergraduate and graduate students, are planning on careers in public history, sort of public-facing work rather than academic-facing work. So working in museums, archives, libraries, historic sites, that sort of thing. And so doing a podcast was wonderful training experience for them because they had become very adept at writing essays for their professors. Very analytical, good argument, lots of sources, plenty of footnotes. And those kinds of essays would be entirely unappealing to a public audience. And so what they had to learn, the skill they had to learn in working on a podcast, was how to write in a way that would engage a public audience as opposed to make their professor happy. And this was really hard for them because they really had no experience with that previously. And further, they had to write it in what to them sounded like my voice as the narrator. So they would get kind of close to that, and then I would re-edit it more in the way that I speak. But the main point is that they had to learn to write for a public audience, and the first time through for them was torture, just torture. Yeah, over time they got better and better at it, and one of the things that I'll never forget about the show is that one of our very best student producers was an undergraduate named Eleanor, who she just showed up in my office in the fall of her freshman year in college and said, "Hey, I understand you're working on a podcast about the Appalachian Trail. I want in." And I thought, okay, I'm going to reward that initiative. And they said, sure, join the team. And she did. And I would say that of our 5 best episodes, she produced 2 of them as a freshman or sophomore. Yeah. And then she was great because after 2 seasons of working on the show, I said, "So you're going to come back for the 3rd season?" And she said, "No, I feel like I've learned what I can learn from you." So that's Eleanor. But yeah, she was really, really great. And really, really good at interviewing and people, and coming up with interviews and asking the right questions during the interviews. I would always interview with the students, and because my content knowledge is a little deeper than theirs. But she was fantastic. And several of the students ended up getting jobs after their bachelor's or MA programs, in part because of their experience on the podcast. And I say in part because during the from your experience that tons of people apply for a job, and the hardest part as the applicant is getting from the big pile of applications to the small pile. And their experience on the podcast got them moved from that big, huge pile of applications into the small pile that the interviewer or the committee is going to think more seriously about. And I know this because a number of them told me that during their job interviews, somebody would say, "Well, now tell us about that podcast you worked on. We're really interested in that." So that was sort of a hook that helped them get noticed in the competitive application process. And the other thing about a podcast, from working on it, is that it's a very intimate form of communication because people listen to your show mostly with earbuds in, or they may be in their car by themselves. People don't tend to listen to podcasts with others. And so if they have their earbuds in, you're speaking to them from inside their head, which the first time I said that to some of our students, one of them said, "Well, now that sounds creepy." But it's really true. I mean, you're there, you're a voice in their head. And so how you speak to them just has to be really different than how you would give a public lecture, for instance.
Yeah, I never thought about that. Thank you. So did you get pushback from any of your peers that you were going to let them off the hook writing essays and let them do a fun podcast?
I didn't. My department at George Mason has always been a very kind of entrepreneurial group of historians willing to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And so my former colleague, Roy Rosenzweig, who our Digital History Center is named for, he kind of invented the field of digital history. And he was the first person to really push it forward. And the idea that you would create a website instead of write an article would not fly in most history departments 25 years ago. And my department, their attitude was, "Wow, that sounds really cool. Let me know how that goes." And so over the years, I got some pushback about some of my other teaching interventions, but podcasting, people thought, "Oh, wow, that sounds great. Students will get really good experience."
Probably would have really enjoyed you as a professor, but probably because it sounds like you're trying to think of different things to do and innovative ways.
Well, the students who didn't like me as a professor were the ones who had figured out how to be successful in a standard version history class. You know, the professor comes in, lectures, they take notes, they write some papers, they take some tests based on what happened in the lectures, and they do well. And my classes were never like that. Some of my students did find that frustrating because they had mastered the skill of being successful in a standard history class. One of them said to me one day, "I just don't know what you want." And I said, "Well, what I want is thinking." And I remember him staring at me like, "I'm not quite sure what you mean by that." So those students found me a little frustrating, but others I think mostly thought I was a breath of fresh air.
Well, my best teachers were always ones who would push thinking instead of just memorize, and here's the test.
Yeah, I'm terrible at memorization. I used to tell them all the time that the internet was one of the best things that happened to me because I couldn't remember names, dates, that sort of thing, so I could just look it up.
My wife and I, we were always on road trips and would always talk about, boy, if we could only look things up when we're in the car. And now we can.
Of course, it also means you get fact-checked.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's the other thing about AI. Don't always trust AI if you're looking for facts.
Right. You actually have to tell it when you prompt it, I want the following things, and if you don't know the answer, I want you to say that. Do not make up answers. And then it won't. But you have to know to say that.
Yeah, well, I caught it lying to me one time, and it wouldn't have been catastrophic, but it wouldn't have been good. When I said something about it, it answered back, and it said, well, I was just trying to make you happy.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I'm working on a biography now, but I have pretty limited source base, and so I asked one of the AIs. This was 2 years ago. For some references for articles that might speak to the problem of writing biography with a limited source base. And a couple of it gave me like 4 or 5 choices, and a couple of them I already knew, but one, man, it sounded perfect. And so I immediately, went to the university library website and started trying to find it. I found the author, and she'd written a number of things that were kind of adjacent to what I was interested in, but she had not written, I couldn't find that article. And I realized, the AI just made that up. And so I went back to the AI and I said, you just made up that article. And it said, oh, I'm so sorry. I promise I won't do it again.
It blows me away that it would admit it.
Yeah, well, they just want to make you happy. And if telling the truth makes you happy, then okay, you're happy.
So you mentioned in your survey about, and I'm going to butcher the name, N.O.
Cray.
Cray?
Yeah, just like it's pronounced like Cray.
Okay, N.O. Cray?
Yeah.
So, and he had a lot of influence on you? He was an early professor?
N.O. or Mr. Cray, I went to the University of Virginia, and in those days, professors were always Mr. or Ms., not doctor or professor. And so, but he was the most amazing educator I've ever encountered. And I happened to encounter him on my very first day as a college student. And I was 17 years old. Didn't turn 18 for 6 or 7 more weeks. It was in the 1970s, and so advising was essentially non-existent for freshmen, and so I ended up my RA in my dorm was my advisor, and I said that he was a history major, and I said, what do you think I ought to take? And he said, well, don't take any of those 100-level courses because you already have the AP credits for those, and so just take an upper-level history class that sounds interesting. And then, get some gen eds out of the way. So I saw European diplomatic history on the schedule, and it fit with my other classes, and it sounded I was interested in diplomatic history. And the fact that it had a 500 course number next to it, I remember still, it was European History 553, didn't register with me that it was a graduate course. And because how would I know? I've been at college.
You were 17 years old.
Right, and I'd been in college for 48 hours. How did I know? I just knew it was going to be harder than a 100-level course. And so I went, and it was the very first class I attended in college. And I always liked to sit in the back of the room because I wanted to see if other people were raising their hands before I raised mine. I got there early, and I was sitting in the back, and these other students start filtering in, and I'm thinking, wow, those third and fourth year students look pretty old. and so then the professor comes in and up at the front of the room, and there was only one door in this classroom. It was up at the front of the room, and he comes in and sets all his stuff down. And I still remember he was wearing like a tweed jacket because it was the 70s, and he was not smoking a pipe, but he did have a tweed jacket. He was a little kind of fidgety up in the front of the room with all his papers and everything. And then he looked out at us and he said, okay, so how many PhD students? And 2 people raised their hand. And I thought, oh, I got to get out of here now. But the only way out is to get up and walk past everybody in the room and past the professor and out the front door. So maybe I'll just sit quietly and nothing will happen to me. And then most of the class was MA students, and there were a couple of fourth-year students, and then there was me. And so he realized I had not raised my hand yet, and so he pointed to me and he said, why don't you see me after class? And I nodded, and then he went on with the class. And the thing about Enno was that he had a terrible stutter, and he would get really stuck on a syllable, and it seemed like 5 minutes. It was probably 10 seconds, but where his mouth would just work around the syllable trying to get it out. But eventually he would. And he also refused to wear bifocals, so he had 2 pairs of glasses, and he was constantly switching back and forth between his glasses. And it was so distracting for the first 30 minutes. And then you sort of fell into the brilliance of his lecture. And because he really was a brilliant lecturer, and you forgot about the stutter, and you forgot about the weird hand motions with the glasses. So anyway, when class was over, he asked me if I had time to go back to his office with him, and I said yes. And so we get to his office, and he says, so by now you know you're in a graduate course. And I thought he was going to tell me, okay, here's a form to drop the class. And instead he said, tell me what you already know about the subject. I was kind of terrified. So I did. I told him everything I already knew about European diplomacy. And then he asked me some questions about books I'd read. I told him what I'd read. And then he said, okay, I think you could be successful in this course, but you have to come to my office hours every week. Can you do that? And I said, yes. And because he was being so nice to me, of course I was saying yes. And so I did. I did just what he said, and I went to his office hours every single week. And before the midterm, the class only had a midterm and a final. That was the only grading, which was pretty typical at UVA then. And so before the midterm, he gave me a prior midterm that he had given in the class and 2 blue books from student essay answers, one that was an A and one that was a C. And he told me he wanted me to read those and then come back and tell him why he'd given one student an A and why he'd given one student a C, which saved me because I'd never taken an essay exam in my life. And so, we did that whole exercise, and I ended up making a B in that course. Some of my other classes suffered a little, I think, but that was okay. I got a B in that course, and then it was a 2-semester course, and I took it again the second semester, and I made an A in a grad course as a freshman. But it's because he helped me every step of the way. And then I did my senior seminar with him, my senior research seminar, my final year of college. So I ended up taking 3 classes from him. He was really, really influential. But I'll never forget, and I never forgot in 30 years of college teaching, I never forgot the kindness that he showed me, but also the fact that he didn't just default to administrative procedure, like, oh, you're a freshman, you need to get out of this class.
Yeah, what a good guy. So did that kind of frame, did you take how he reacted to you, to your students, to your career as a professor?
I did my best to do that for 30 years. I tried to remember to always bring my humanity to work every day because students have so much going on in their lives, and it's so challenging for them, and especially at a place like George Mason where I taught for so long, where the average age of our undergrads was more like 24. We had a lot of, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but we also had an awful lot of older students who had child care responsibilities, elder care responsibilities. They were working 3 jobs. They They didn't have time for the standard college experience as it's portrayed in Hollywood. And so, their lives could, they were Iraq war veterans. They just had all these things in their lives. And so remembering to bring your humanity to work every day, not just 2 or 3 days a week, I think was really, really critical. And that's a lesson I learned from him.
Yeah. Did you find it more difficult? And I'll go back through my career. I found out people who were in the same job for a number of years kind of became cynical and they quit doing a good job at it. Is that a struggle for a professor to see? I mean, they're different students, but kind of the same. Do you have to struggle year over year?
I think it's hard for some people. They do become cynical in their jobs and probably in their lives as well. And I think some of that cynicism comes from a sense that they're not making progress themselves. And so they're just kind of spinning their wheels a little bit professionally. And others, I think they just kind of get grumpy as they get older. It's the only way I can put it. But but you do see this kind of cynicism about students, and I think it's really unfortunate because the students, I mean, some of them probably bring cynicism to class with them, but mostly they're there to learn something, even if it's a required course that they don't really want to take, or really, really, really don't want to take. They still hope to get something out of it. Like I remember, I used to teach a course that was required of all undergrads. Our board of trustees decided that every student had to take Western Civ, and that lasted for about, 10, 12 years. And so, if you're a physics major, that was not on your agenda as something you wanted to take. I remember a student evaluation once where the student wrote, "This class was surprisingly not boring. Thank you." I thought, okay, it's a very low bar to have, made it over. But I never forgot my class was surprisingly not boring.
Yeah, well, that's a good comment.
Yeah,
I guess for someone who doesn't really want to be there and doesn't think they need that class.
Yeah. But also, higher education has changed so dramatically in the last 30 years. When I first started teaching in 1994, I was actually teaching in Europe for a year. So the first year of full-time teaching in the U.S. was 96. Only half of my students had email addresses, and the internet was still just green or white pixels on a black screen, and graphical web browsers appeared the following year. And then all of a sudden there was this World Wide Web, and with increasing amounts of information available. And then that increasing amount turned into a fire hose of information. And so instead of helping students figure out how to access the internet, we had to help them figure out how to filter the internet and make sense of all that information. And then in 2007, the iPhone appeared and all the subsequent imitators, and that changed things again. And now AI is changing things again. And so it's a very different landscape. And so if you're an educator and you're not up to grappling with all that change, it gets really hard.
And to tell you the truth, not being an educator, I wouldn't even think of it. I would just expect that my professor would come in tip-top knowing everything, but I'm sure that was a lot of work for you.
Well, it was, because I'm not the most technologically savvy person. And so, I could build a web page and it was highly functional, but it was not pretty. I had no design skills. So I could do that. And I was really good at searching and finding and filtering. But, I never learned programming languages. And I have younger colleagues who, got their PhDs 15, 20 years after me, who learning to program as part of their historical education was just kind of standard stuff. They can just write a little code to make it do X or Y. And I couldn't write any code. And so, and I had to ultimately decide I'm not going to do that. I have too many other things to do. I'll let somebody else write the code for me. The speed of change seems to accelerate with each passing year. And one of the default positions of a lot of educators is to say to students, you may not. So I can remember people saying, you may not use Wikipedia, or you may not use AI. And that's, if you remember the old Charlie Brown cartoon shows, the adults were this voice in the background. You never saw an adult. They were just this sort of voice that went like, wah, 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 wah. And that's what students hear when professors say to them, you may not use AI, or you may not use Wikipedia or whatever. And so that's not a helpful position for an educator to take.
Because it's here.
I said to somebody not too long ago, okay, cars are at the root of a lot of our health problems. And because when we had to walk to work or ride a horse to work, we got a lot of exercise. And so we were healthier, and physically healthier anyway. Maybe we had dietary problems or something, but our skeletal and motoskeletal system was pretty good. But we're not giving up those cars. They're too convenient. And so students aren't going to give up on AI because it's too convenient.
Blue Ridge, keep on calling me. Rolling hills and the sweet pine trees. Every road and every song I sing leads me home to where my heart takes wing. Barn dance, fiddle on a Saturday night.
In your survey, you begin by just sitting with the thing. What's that look like in practice?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways that historians do archival research, and each one of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. And I think as a researcher, you, over time, find your way to the version of that works for you and helps you achieve the objectives that you're trying to achieve. When I begin a research project and I start gathering archival materials, then at some point I have a body of stuff, whether it's text or images or film or whatever it might be. And then I just, as you said from my survey, I sit with it. I let it, I kind of marinate in it, and I let it tell me what it wants to say. And so for my most recent book, A Hiker's History of the Appalachian Trail, I used as my main source logbooks that hikers have filled in shelters all up and down the Appalachian Trail. There are about 250 of these shelters, and each one of them has a logbook in it, and hikers who stop by write something, many of them. And those logbooks have been saved kind of idiosyncratically over the decades by the various clubs that maintain the trail. But there are many, many hundreds of them spread out over at least 7 decades. And so volunteers at the Appalachian Trail Museum, bless them, have been digitizing these logbooks. And I went to Germany as a Fulbright scholar in 2024, and I brought with me a thumb drive with thousands of pages of those logbooks. And I was there by myself, so I had a lot of me time. And during that me time, I spent hours each day just reading what people wrote in the 1940s or the 1960s or the 1990s or the 2000s about their hike today. Like, we saw a mother turkey with 5 chicks running across the trail, or it was so nice to be in the shelter while it was sleeting outside, or I haven't cooked over an open fire in 20 years. I love it. It's just statements like that. And so I read and read and read, and I slowly let the story of the hiking experience emerge organically from all of that text. And it's a very non-systematic approach to research. I didn't code any of the language that they, categorize it in any way. I didn't put it in a database. I just marinated in it.
What was the best log entry that you read?
Well, I actually gave a presentation last night about the book in a bar in downtown DC, and to about 120 people, and I told them that if it had been up to me, I would have named the book "I Saw a Bobcat" with 3 or 4 exclamation points, because I must have seen that half a dozen times in over the decades in various locations up and down the trail. And for some reason, when people saw a bobcat, they would write it, and they would always put multiple exclamation points. And And I'll say, if I ever see one on the trail, I've seen one in our old suburban neighborhood in Manassas, but I have not seen one on the Appalachian Trail. I've heard them in the, up on the ridge crawling, but I've never seen one in the wild like that. And I'll probably use multiple exclamation points too. But that would be a terrible book title because the Amazon algorithm would not pick it up as an Appalachian Trail book. So, so that was my alternative fantasy title. But I loved that one. And the other thing I loved was a lot of hikers wrote poetry and put it into these shelter logs. And I actually included one of those poems as the final page of the book. It was from Georgia in 1990, I think, and just really beautiful. And so I really loved, because I can't write poetry at all. I have zero, maybe less than zero ability to write poetry. And so I have so much respect for people who can. I lead off the book with what I think is the best poem about backpacking that I've ever read. And it was written for me at a pop-up poetry event in Canada a number of years ago by a poet named Richard Harrison. And I don't know if you've ever been to a pop-up poetry event, but poets are there with their little Royal or Smith Corona manual typewriters, and you sit down in front of them and they say, okay, what do you want a poem about? And you tell them, and then they bang out a poem on the manual typewriter, and you've got it. And it's an incredible skill, and to me, just unimaginable. And so I said to Richard, who I knew, I want a poem about backpacking. And he said, oh, that's really interesting. I've never been backpacking. Tell me about it. And so we talked for, 10 minutes. And then he said, okay, I got one for you, but it's short. And so if you want a longer one, you feel ripped off by such a short poem, let me know, and I'll write a longer one. And so here's the poem. And it is very short. And it's still, I think, the best one I've ever heard. And it goes like this. In the mountains, a mind becomes a heart.
That's great.
That's the poem.
That's good.
And I looked at it and I said, Richard, you nailed it. Thank you. And it's the opening epigraph in my book.
Is it really? That's fabulous.
Doesn't get better, in my view.
Writers, like you mentioned, Barry Lopez and John Krakauer. You want to talk about them?
Really inspired by people who can write creative nonfiction, because I was not trained in that at all. I mean, I thought I was going to be a journalist when I went to college, so I did creative nonfiction for a few years as a student reporter, but I took a bunch of classes in it, but that wasn't my career at all. When I started writing public-facing work 7-8 years ago, I guess, I thought, well, I should read some of the best environmental writers, and because I'm writing things about environmental experiences or experiences in nature. And so I started actually with Barry Lopez's National Book Award. I just, I Googled like National Book Award environmental writing or something like that. And Arctic Dreams came up as one of the top choices. And so I got it and read it and then read it straight through a second time. It was that good. And if I could write even half as well as Barry Lopez, I would think that I was making progress. And, he's just been he passed away in 2020 of cancer, but he's really one of the greatest environmental writers in English, not just in the U.S., but just writing in English, and published a number of books and countless articles. One of the things I really respected about Lopez is that in addition to his ability to bend the language in ways that served his purposes, to tell the stories he wanted to tell, he was also someone who had a deep respect for the natural world and for those who were of the natural world. So indigenous people, environmental scientists, anybody who was deeply immersed in the natural world. He had so much respect for them and would try his best to tell their stories as part of the story of the environment. And so, he has a long essay about a wolf biologist in Alaska who he spent a month with, and things like that. And so I was just really, really inspired by that. And also he was an incredibly gentle person, and so wrote about nature and about the people he met in very gentle ways, which I liked. And then Krakauer is much more famous because his work has been lots of bestsellers, Into the Wild, which then became a movie, And it started as an essay in Outside Magazine, then turned into a book, and then turned into a movie, and then Into Thin Air about a disastrous climb on Everest, and Under the Banner of Heaven about the Mormon Church. And, he wrote all these books that have been wildly successful. Krakauer also was a kind of an experience-based writer, or still is, and by that I mean he spent a lot of time immersed in his subject, talking endlessly to people who were in some way involved in the story, and going to the places. And sometimes, like, he was on the climb in Everest, that he was on near the summit when everything went wrong, and so he's very able to talk about the places that he was and the people. He was able to do that in ways that I really respect.
Nothing better than a writer like that. So, and for me, it's, Childs and Abbey and Mark Reisner. But have you ever read Marjorie Stoneman Douglas?
I have not. I only know the name because of the high school.
Yeah, the high school. She wrote about the Everglades, and I think it's Blades of Grass, something like that. And that was the closest to reading her book was like poetry. Her words just flowed. She was an amazing author. And unfortunately, everybody knows her because of the high school now. I've been bombarding you with questions. So what do you have anything that you want to get through and say?
The other thing I would say is, my first book about the Appalachian Trail, which is called Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail, that book was written as, it was like a rabbit hole that opened up in front of me in the archives. I was working on the book. I was researching the book, which came out in October of 25, but I was completely diverted by something I found in the archives into the story that became this other book, which came out in 23. And so the current book would have come out a lot sooner had I not gotten diverted. But I'm so glad I did. And I think the lesson that I learned from that is that when you're doing research, sometimes rabbit holes open up in front of you. And I think this is true of all kinds of research. I used to tell my students that it was incumbent on them to stand at the edge of the rabbit hole and peer down into it the way that Alice did before she jumped in, because they owe it to themselves to at least look and see what's down there. And that 98% of the time, they back away and finish up whatever it was that they were working on. But every once in a while, you jump in. And I'm so glad that I jumped into this particular rabbit hole, because it took me to a part of the state of Virginia that I didn't know well, even though I was born there, but we moved away when I was 5. And so I have like one memory, maybe 2 memories of living there. But it took me back into that part of the state, and I've made wonderful friends there, many of them decades older than me, and I'm 67. And now I'm on the board of a little nonprofit music school down there, and so I'm going on Friday for a board meeting. And so it led me into this whole connection to a truly wonderful part of the state that is so rural that I think where the nonprofit is, it's in Floyd County, Virginia, and the whole county has one traffic light, and right in the middle of downtown Floyd, the county seat. And so, but the other thing that I learned from writing that book is that I thought it was a book about one thing, and it turned out to be a book about something else. And I thought it was about the rerouting of the Appalachian Trail in the 1950s away from that part of the state. And that's kind of the organizing principle of the book. But the book is really about people who live in very rural areas and how important historical memory is to them, how intrinsic it is to their lives. That was a really wonderful lesson for me, that sometimes you think you're writing one thing, but as you begin writing, you realize you're writing something entirely different and better.
What brings you to nonprofit leadership?
Oh, how did I get started with that? Well, before I became a historian, I was a consultant and management consultant, marketing consultant in the nonprofit sector. And so I had a lot of experiences with nonprofits, mostly educational institutions, some healthcare organizations. And so I spent, kind of 10 years in the mission-driven sector. And then when it was time for me to start researching my dissertation, I needed to get to Eastern Europe because my original work was on East European history. And I missed out on the various fellowships that were available. I wasn't successful getting any of those. But I did take a job with a nonprofit called the Civic Education Project, which was bringing advanced doctoral students to the formerly communist countries in the early 90s to help rebuild higher education there. And so I taught at a university in Bratislava, Slovakia for a year. And through that work, I got connected to the organization a little bit better and ultimately ended up on the board and then chair of the board. And from that, I ended up on a couple of other boards along the way. And so now I'm on two, the Handmade Music School in Floyd, Virginia, and the Appalachian Trail Museum in Pine Grove Furnace State Park, Pennsylvania.
And that's how we met. It was the Floyd Music School. You put something up on Facebook. We should get to our wives. You credited your wife, Susan, as your greatest influence. What she taught you about leadership?
I would say that Susan's greatest impact on my leadership is that I became a much better listener than I was when I started getting into leadership roles. I was more of a talker and less of a listener, and I'm still probably, she would say, more of a talker than a listener, but she really taught me to be a much better listener. And so as a result, I was much more successful in the various things that I did.
Yeah, it's good to be a listener. For that matter, I got a book coming out real soon, and it's about listening.
Oh, perfect.
So what's inspired you this past week?
I would say I'm going to answer that in the most immediate example, and that is that Susan and I were out hiking on the Appalachian Trail this morning because our cabin is very close to the trail, and it is wildflower season here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and so the trilliums are in full force. Jack and the pulpits are up, the May apples are up, the little star plants. I think maybe they're star anise. I'm not positive. And then I found a very rare yellow lady slipper. They're very, very uncommon and very endangered. And so just seeing the sort of resilience of the natural world in the face of all of the climate problems that we're still at the front end of, it always really inspires me.
Is there a link where people can pick up your books at?
Yeah, they can just go to my website, which is millskelly.net. And so it's millskelly.net, and all the ordering information is there. I actually ask people to order through bookshop.org rather than through the bigger online retailers. Bookshop is a nonprofit that funnels most of the money from the sale to independent bookstores. So when you choose your favorite independent bookstore, I've got 3 of my favorites listed on the site, and then you order the book, and the credit goes to that store.
Okay. Well, I will definitely order some books, and I'm sorry I didn't read anything beforehand.
So we'll just make it your go-to place from now on.
Okay. Mills, thank you so much. Well,
all right, Steve,
go have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Artbox Podcast. We're recording from our home studio inside the Mesquite Steam Center, right here in the beautiful Mojave Desert, where creativity and curiosity meet under wide open skies. From the written word and poetry to collage, brush art, pencil, ink, fabric, and pottery, from theater and song to archaeology in our public lands, we celebrate the many ways creativity shows up in the world around us. You can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Boomplay, or your favorite podcast app. We'd love to hear from you. Find us at theartboxpodcast.com. Drop us a note anytime at artboxvv@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to tell your friends so they can join the conversation too. Most importantly, take a moment to follow and support the artists and creative souls who join us here, because their stories are what make the Artbox come alive. This is Daisy, and until next time, keep creating, keep exploring,
and keep sharing your story.